But we have all this data, how do we present it in a way that's interesting? Oh wait, you can make videos on 15 screens in this 50 projectors covering the central square of Mexico City. And in this piece in particular, I really love because they show you the code and they show you on the other screen what the code is doing. We don't have a gigantic warehouse, we have a castle. There's a marketing problem, there's a design problem.
My experience started with when I first time seeing the Day and Night Festival recap movie, and when I saw that, I understand how disruptive and how different can be one new media festival. What I saw on that recap showing me the potential of the new media and collaboration on different fields, including music and maybe some talks. Here I start to studying more about new media artists. Here I find about Refi Canadol. Here I find about Non-Attack, about Tundra, and my learning process on the new media started with the tools of artists and that first step in new media art. I want to invite on the stage Czetwertynski, new media art curator and artist from Electric Castle.
Thank you very much. That's me. Hello, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to come to Moldova. So, yeah, I guess I'll start whenever you guys are ready. I think one of the things that we talked about when you invited me to come here was to explore some topics that are related to, I guess, what you were calling creativity when we were having our conversations. So one of the things that I tend to do and is think about this idea of the connection between art and commerce, because it's just something that's always a problem in the stuff that I do, because people ask about it, I think about it, I'm like, oh, am I doing this because it's art? Am I doing this because it's a job? And so one of the things that comes up a lot in these conversations is the Medici. You guys are probably all familiar with the Medici, famous patrons of the arts, but they were also never giving money to artists just because they wanted to give money, but because it was good for them. So I wrote this article about the Medici metaphor, and that's one thing that I try to do as much as possible is to write, to think about what I do and to share these thoughts, because I think one thing that's really important in the new media field is that there's very little critical thinking and discussion about the work. It's a new field, it's an emerging field, so you know, if you look at photography, you look at sculpture, you look at any other field, there are magazines, there are critics, there are people who are like going to the shows and they're saying, this was terrible, or this was great, or we love this artist, or this was like a total waste of time. But in the new media field, we don't have that so much. That's sort of the thing that I try to, you know, put in focus for myself. This is where I studied in France. I studied philosophy, and you always have to have a meme in a presentation, so this is my meme. But I was sort of interested in philosophy because I felt that it was a path towards understanding what you're doing, understanding culture, and trying to go beyond just being like super focused on a single field. So I felt it was a good way to like have a broad approach to everything that I was touching. And after I finished philosophy, I started a production company in Paris, in France, called Disciple Films. And I would do like a mix of things, like I started working a lot in fashion, and I would go and document fashion shows and fashion events, and I would try to make the videos kind of fun and short and dynamic. And I would also do these like crazy art movies that somehow got commissioned by Japanese people who thought it was cool to see a light transform into an animal. And then in the meantime, to make money, I would go and film surgeries. So I would get hired by doctors and I would go in like surgical blocks, and it was very weird. Then then I moved to Los Angeles and I got a job in this company, Frank the Plumber. And it's not a plumbing company. It's a company that made videos for stages for like big artists. And so I did stuff like this. Like I did videos for Beyonce, for Rihanna, for Madonna, for Stevie Wonder, for, you know, every big artist that you can think of. I was working for 3 years in just making this kind of stuff. It was kind of a revelation for me because I was coming from making videos for a screen, like a 16:9 screen, and then all of a sudden I realized, oh wait, you can make videos on 15 screens in the same time and they're all different shapes and some of them can move. So wait a minute, this is cool. So I did that for a few years and then I was invited to do this, which was a project in Mexico City. I was working with 10 or 15 super talented 3D artists, projection mapping people, 50 projectors covering the central square of Mexico City, doing an hour-long show for hundreds of thousands of people about the history of Mexico. All of this done, you know, gigantic 3D stuff. This, you know, was at the time pretty hardcore. Now projection mapping is not trendy anymore, but at the time it felt like, oh, okay, this is kind of, you know, new. So yeah, so that was an interesting thing. And then after that, I quit this whole Frank the Plumber thing, and I started working with other artists, in particular Doug Aitken, who was commissioned to do this big piece on a building in Seattle. And the idea was that the building was going to respond to the city. It was called Mirror. And so it was taking in all this data from the city about the weather and what was going on. And my job was to try to help him to find a way to make the building never be the same twice. Even though he had shot all this footage, it was all the same footage, it was constantly re-editing the footage in different ways based on, hey, it's Monday, it's rainy, and there are a lot of people in the street. What are we going to put on the screen? So it was like this kind of crazy, we had to come up with a brain that was, at the time there was no AI tools. This was all done in Touch Designer, which is a very common tool in our industry. So this was like, for me, another really interesting project where it was like, okay, let's go beyond even doing spatial media, but let's do like media that's almost intelligent. And then I started really getting into more and more technology-based stuff. So this was a project for Nike that was done in 2012 or 11. At the time, photogrammetry was not a big thing. Now you can do it with your phone. But basically, the Nike wanted to present their new collection in the most technologically advanced way possible. So we scanned all these athletes. We put them in a Unity game engine. We made it available on iPads and on the web. And it was like, at the time, you had to have a Unity plugin to play it. It was very like ahead of its time in a way, but it was a super great learning experience for basically, you know, engaging with this kind of stuff. This was a project that came from the Nike thing. So I was invited to work on a video for a band called Gus Gus, an Icelandic sort of electronic band, and I used all these techniques of like photogrammetry. But with Nike, we were trying to make these like perfect humans that look great and that were like dynamic, but, you know, like sculptural. And here was like, no, let's make it fucked up. And that's kind of the idea of like that tension between commercial and art, is in a way like you use these techniques in a commercial way because, you know, a brand wants something nice and polished, but then you get to work with a band that's all crazy people, and then you can make them look like they're, you know, completely messed up and just weird. So I continue to explore like a different software techniques. I've always had a strong relationship with fashion designers. So this is a collaboration with some fashion designers where they were like, hey, we're really interested in fractals. And I found this software that makes fractals in 3D that's like very, very weird, that's developed by a guy in his basement that has almost no documentation, and it's like very obscure. But you can make these insane 3D environments. And so basically I worked on this for like 2 years to put these people inside these environments, and it was very, very intense. But it was a beautiful project that involved like sort of the idea of humans being both the macro and the micro. So each human is like a portal into another world, and then in the other world there's another human, and it's like these Russian dolls. Like you keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into these worlds. And it ended up being shown in an art museum, and so this was really a project that was done for the love, and that ended up unlocking a lot of things for me, mostly on the art side. But in the same time, I was doing things like this, which were projects for Google, again, very much more commercial, but using similar approaches as the things that I had done for Doug Aitken, for example, where they were like, hey, we've got this boring software that does analytics on the web. It's got all these cool things, but we have all this data. How do we present it in a way that's interesting? And so the idea was, okay, well, let's make a sculpture, and then let's use the data, but let's make these animations that feel like they're maybe a little bit more beautiful than your graphs and your pie charts and your normal representations of the data. So this was an interesting collaboration with Google that was shown at their Google I/O conference, which happens every year, where all the developers go. But then in the same time, Google also asked me to do something at the Met Museum, and this was for a different branch of Google called Arts and Culture, and they wanted to make something that took over the entire staircase at the Met, which is a very impressive place when you go there. And they wanted a photo booth, but it seemed ridiculous to do something like a photo booth at the Met. It was like a little bit too grandiose. So I created this frame with these fishing lines, and then the projection was kind of shining through it, so people would stand in front of it. They would have their picture taken, but it was almost like they appeared like they were in this multi-dimensional world between the stairs and the frame. And in the same time, I was also continuing to work with musicians. This was a tour that I did with Childish Gambino. Childish Gambino is a very interesting person to work with, because he's exactly the kind of person that's like got a very clear artistic vision, but he's also a collaborator. And so he's the kind of person that will tell you, I'm looking for this, but then he also wants you to come back with a response. And so that's also an interesting dynamic where you're like, yes, I'm working for a client, but it's also maybe a little bit more free than having like just a pitch from a random brand. Similarly, I did another project maybe a year before for Martin Garrix and Microsoft. And the idea was that we would create this crazy environment that was a mix of reflection and projection. And so ended up being this space that looked like kind of liquid and very dynamic. I was commissioned by Samsung to do a series of animations that ended up being shown in a gigantic screen that they have in a space in New York, which looks like this. And so, again, it's like those are the kinds of interesting dynamics when a brand comes to you and says, hey, we've got this huge canvas, what can you do for us? And then here's some loose ideas about what we're looking for, and so it becomes like an interesting way of interacting with clients. And I was in the same time, continuing to do projects that were purely art projects. So this is a project that was commissioned by the Museum of Literature in Warsaw. This was a project that was about plants' dream life, which is a topic I've always been interested in. On the other hand, I was also developing a whole path in curation. Curation in the sense, basically selecting artists that are in my network to show other people. You mentioned the Day for Night Festival, which was the first time I really did this like professionally. So I was invited by Day for Night, which was actually, I shouldn't say I was invited, because the festival didn't exist, and the guy who created the festival called me and he said, hey, we want to do a festival that's not your usual festival. Like every festival, every music festival is typically tents and stages and then maybe some food stands and some hot dogs and beer, and then eventually there'll be like a light installation in a corner because it's like cool to take pictures in front of it. But this was not that. He was like, I want to do something where the art is as important as the music. And that was kind of the first time I'd ever heard of something like that. So, you know, we started commissioning all these artists. We had pretty decent budgets. We had gigantic spaces. And so we could do pieces, you know, as you can see, that are pretty big. This is Nonotac. This is Nonotac Live. This was a guy called Ezra Miller. United Visual Artists, Tundra, this is one of the biggest pieces that they did. This was a really interesting school in New York called the School for Poetic Computation. So these are guys who teach code, but code as poetry. So when you go and study there, you don't just learn how to code, but you learn how to code to make art. And in this piece in particular, I really love because they show you the code and they show you on the other screen what the code is doing. So when the code changes, the result changes too. So that was a really nice piece because a lot of people came to the festival and they sat in front of this and they had never seen anything like it. They're like, what? This is doing that? And after we showed this piece, we had a bunch of people in Houston where we did this festival come to us and say, I stopped being a painter. I just learned how to code because I love this, this possibility. This was another educational group, which is called the Processing Foundation. They created a programming language that is specifically for arts. And what they were doing is that they had cameras, and people would stand in front of the cameras or the microphones, and they would just rotate between all the algorithms that are commonly used in the field that we call creative coding, which is using code for arts. And then, you know, in 2018, the Day for Night Festival ended, but then I got a call from the guys from Electric Castle. And Electric Castle, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, it's a big festival in Transylvania near Cluj. And they said, hey, we saw Day for Night, we want to do something like that, but we don't have a gigantic warehouse, we have a castle. And so I was like, okay, I'll come and see your castle. And I went to see this amazing castle in Transylvania. And I was like, this is really cool because if we take all this digital art and we put it in a building that's from the 17th or the 16th century, all of a sudden we have a different conversation where the art is like, it's put in a different context. We're not just in this sort of, you know, futuristic dystopian world, but it's almost like it's the past and the future that are in conversation. So this was another piece by Nonotac. Again, this is a video that shows you a little bit, but it gives you an impression, a little bit of the scale. But then I think at some point you will see me talking, but you can get a sense of like how it was set up. And this is me with very short hair. But then, you know, again, the curation stuff was never as simple as just, for example, you know, a person saying, hey, I want to do this cool festival, but there's also brands who want curation. And so in this case, Google, again, they came to the festival and they were like, hey, we love this. We want to do, because we work with developers, with people who do code for a living and they make applications, but what if we showed them what people can do with code that's not just apps or, you know, web services and things like that. So for a couple of years, I curated this thing that we called MODA, which was the Museum of Developer Arts, and I commissioned a series of artists to make pieces for the event that were all based on contemporary technologies. So this one here was a artificial intelligence camera, so you stood in front of it and it would try to make some kind of resemblance with your face. These were two pieces that were by very, very strong computational artists. This was a beautiful piece by a group in Germany called Onformative, where they basically designed an algorithm to replicate how rivers operate. So if you look at rivers from satellite view over, I don't know, 100 years, you'll see that they evolve in certain ways, and they managed to figure out a way to replicate that. So the rivers are constantly changing as if you were looking at a super fast view over time from the satellite. This is an artist who collaborates with a robot, so she trained a robot to draw like her, like she draws, and they draw together and they make it a performance. And it's called Undercurrent. So Undercurrent is a project that was, I started working on it in December of 2019. And the idea was presented to me by these guys who have an agency. They do a lot of work for brands. And they were like, you know, we're kind of tired of just working for clients. We want to do our own thing. We want to create our own project. We want to do something that feels like it's important, that it's not just, you know, we're going to do a job, it's going to go in the archives, we're going to do the next job and we'll forget about it and it'll just be in our demo, you know. So the idea of Undercurrent was to bring together a bunch of different things. And I'll show you the first thing that we put out in the world. And I'm sure that you're going to look at this and the first thing you're going to think is it's another festival, right? Because these are all musicians. Some of them are very famous. Others are a little bit more underground. But this is the first video that we put out that explained what Undercurrent was. And I'm sure that when you're done seeing the video, it will still be a little bit unclear what it was. And there's a reason for that, is that this project was very difficult to put together in the sense that it combined many things that are normally never combined. So essentially it comes from the idea that for a lot of brands and a lot of companies, one of the things that they realize that matters today is that you want to connect with an audience based on things that matter to the audience, not just in the sense of like, I really need a pair of new shoes because my shoes are blue and I need pink. You know, it's like, it's more important things than that, things that have to do with our society, with our future, with our children's future. And so when brands are able to make those connections, they end up having deeper relationships with their clients and with their customers. So another thing that's a big phenomenon right now is that you have, I don't know if this is something that exists in Moldova, but in New York, in the States, it's all over the place. It's also in Paris. It's all these pop-up exhibitions. So like the Museum of Ice Cream, the Museum of Color, the Van Gogh light thing, the, you know, Gustav Klimt's get into his painting idea, and everything is like, I'm going to pay 40 euros and I'm going to spend an hour in this space and I'm going to be immersed in something, right? But a lot of these things, what you notice is that people come out of these and they're like, yeah, it was cool. And then they go home and they watch a movie. And it's like, in a sense, I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but the point is that they're designed as entertainment. They're not really designed to create any kind of strong connection between you and something greater than you. They're just sort of there to fill your time. And so this is what we were trying to do. We were trying to create a pop-up exhibition. So something that's ticketed. So you go to a space like a museum, you buy a ticket. But it had to be cause-driven, so it had to be related to something that matters to humanity. We had to be related to nonprofits. It couldn't just be about us selling tickets to put the money in our pocket. We had to contribute to nonprofits. We had to be working with musicians. We had to make an online exhibition and a physical exhibition. And it had to be installations, not performances. And that was the thing that was very tricky about this project, is that once you see a poster with a bunch of musicians, the first thing you think is, I want to see them play. But in this case, we were asking them almost to be like creative directors of an installation based on their cause. And in this case, the cause that we were interested in was the climate, so climate change. Undercurrent in itself is an idea that's bigger than climate change. It will tackle other things in the future, but the first iteration is about climate change. And so we wanted it also to be something that could travel. We wanted to create an exhibition that wouldn't just be a one-off. It had to be able to go to other cities, other countries. So all of these factors, once they were put on the table, it's like a crazy puzzle, because, you know, there's a marketing problem, there's a design problem, there's a getting the stuff out of the artist problem, because we're not going to artists and telling them, hey, here's $2 million, give me an idea. We had to have dialogues with them and say, oh, you're interested in plankton, but what is it about plankton that you're concerned about? Or you're interested in coral reefs. What is it about coral reefs that touches you? So it was like all of these conversations that led to basically making this. So the steps of the process for me my role was to be the creative director of the project across the board. So designing everything, the general look and feel of the event, how it worked, what the installations had to be, what the web experiences had to be. And so all of this was a process that involved having these conversations with the artists, developing creative for them, making renderings that they could see that would show them what it would look like, figuring out the budget, figuring out if the technology that we wanted to use was viable from a budget standpoint. And then we had to maintain it for 3 weeks because it was a 3-week show, so it couldn't be something that was, sometimes when you make installations, if they're going to be, you're lucky. If they're going to be up for like 1 or 2 days, it's a very different dynamic from many levels than if they're going to be up for multiple weeks. And then finally, it had to be built to last so that it could travel. So, my process was to do stuff like this. I would sit in front of my 3D software and I would design stuff that was supposed to look like something. This is obviously not a rendered version, but it just, just to show you sort of like the tools and the different ways that things had to be presented to our technical team, to our artists, an exploration of all these materials. We wanted to use trash as a way to become almost like a scenic element. This is a slide that comes from a deck that was an exploration of how we created the space itself and if we wanted to have transitional elements between the installations. And then there was all the branding work, the development of the logo. So this is a video, it won't have sound, but you'll kind of see like one of the things that we had to do was when we had this problem of like people thinking, oh, you're doing a festival. So we took a LiDAR scan of the building and then, put in like these sort of very, very basic representations of the artists, but just to show that they were actually going to be in a physical space. And when we put out this video, we realized a lot of people understood, oh, it's not a festival, it's not a stage, it's something that has like, it's anchored in a physical space. And these are pictures of the actual event. So these are, there ended up being 11 installations, plus 3 installations for nonprofits that were much smaller. There was a lounge, there was a rooftop with a bar. Some of the installations were a little bit smaller, some of them were bigger. This was Grimes, Grimes's installation. This was an arcade game that we developed for one of the artists, Jada G. This was a bigger one that we did for Georgia Smith with a bunch of recycled bottles. And this was the building that we were doing it in. It's in Bushwick in Brooklyn. We had 3 floors, so you can kind of see the floors that are from the top down, the 3. And so it was an event that now this is like a little recap video. You can see a little bit the sort of diversity of installations that all sort of corresponded to each artist, which was also one of the challenges, is that each artist wanted a different concept. And so some of them were more interactive, some of them were more passive, some of them were very musical, others were a little bit more quiet. So it was an interesting challenge to put this together. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Alex.